there is something to say about a culture in which people believe their spiritual authority to be a disembodied avatar.
Well, welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm Maria Baer alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for the Christian Worldview. We're going to talk today about some of the biggest culture-shaping news stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. You guys will be able to find links to the stories we're talking about today, as well as other resources from the Colson Center at breakpoint.org. John, I have to start with a question that just occurred to me today, and I'm nervous to ask you this because it's going to reveal my lack of knowledge of something that I know is very close to your heart. Is March Madness happening? Is it a
happening.
Thing? It is?
Well, sort of. So I'm a Duke fan. It's not happening for them for two reasons. Okay. Number one is that they're really bad this year. And number two, they had one chance to get in, which was to win the conference tournament. And a walk-on got COVID. And so they got booted out of the tournament. They weren't going to win anyway. It would have been a long shot. But it is happening. Okay. And it's going to be, I think, a lot of fun. It's going to be a good tournament. I think they're doing it all in one location.
Okay. Do you fill out one of the bracket things and decide who you think is going to win?
I usually fill out 5 or 6.
Okay.
But I thought, like, last year when everything was canceled, I was actually at an event in Texas. And the same night as when everything just started, getting canceled. And then Fort Worth kicked us out of the city and, go home. So I thought, wow, Fort Worth is sending you home. This thing is for real.
That's a bad sign.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Get out of here and take your guns with you. That's kind of Fort Worth's mantra. But I remember tweeting about a week into this that I knew how the Narnians felt, that it was always March and never madness. Never. So I thought that was a pretty clever thing. I was proud of that one.
That is pretty good. Okay, well, I'm glad it's happening. I just can't get into basketball, John. I'm so sorry. I think part of it is those guys just take themselves way too seriously.
It's not nearly as much as who should I bust on? I mean.
Football's worse.
Football's worse. Hollywood's way worse, right? Hollywood's way worse.
That's true.
The Situation just basically said he's going to snub and boycott the Grammys because he didn't get a nomination.
Who is that? That's a person that refers to himself? He was the guy that sang at halftime of the Super Bowl, right? No, that's The Weeknd.
Oh, that's The Situation.
Gosh, you're so
No,
old.
this is so funny.
Old.
This is something for you to make fun of me. Yes, it was The Weeknd, actually, not The Situation. Mm-hmm. And I have been confusing those two.
Isn't The Situation the guy from Jersey Shore?
Yes.
Oh, my word.
And I have confused those two. Seriously, the whole run-up to the Super Bowl, I was like, is that guy now a musician? And I had no idea we were talking about the same guy. And then my daughters were like, oh, Dad.
I have so many questions that we don't have time for right now. But that you would know The Situation and be familiar with his career. Anyway, we'll get to that
I have
later.
To explain this. You can't just let this go. I have to actually explain this, which is, so there was a set of, a set of years where I was traveling all across the United States with a group of college students talking about worldviews. And I was doing it with a group called the Worldview Team out of the college that I was working at. And so we would look at pop culture. So we would play clips of movies and television shows and that sort of stuff. And it was near the end of that show, Jersey Shore became a thing. And I had tons of Snooki jokes, tons.
Oh,
I mean, and it was kind of easy.
Imagine.
It was like, you went from Paris Hilton jokes to Snooki jokes to and Miley Cyrus jokes. And that's kind of how it went by that time. So. Well,
do me a favor and go find your notes from that, because I would like to. It would make my heart so happy if we could just bring up tons of Snooki jokes. Like, we're just so many years too late, but just bring them up when you find that there's a relevant spot for it, and that'll be our thing.
I will.
Okay.
I will. It has something to do with Neil Postman and entertaining ourselves to death and
right.
not knowing anything about what the philosophers thought, but caring whenever Snooki sneezed. That's how I said it. So that was pretty good.
That's pretty good.
Thank you. I'm here.
That's pretty good. Okay, fair enough. That's how you know who The Situation is. Okay. I just want to let the record show that I had forgotten The Situation was a real thing until John Stonestreet brought it up. So just let the record show.
For the record.
Okay, we have to talk about actual stuff that matters. So the first thing that I wanted to get your take on this week is that it was International Women's Day. I don't know if you knew that, and appropriately honored the women in your life on that day. But it was International Women's Day, and on that day, President Biden issued 2 new executive orders. One of them was creating a new policy, a gender council policy, something. All I know is this existed under President Obama, but it used to be called the Council for Women and Girls. But we are notably not calling it the Council for Women and Girls anymore. Now it's the Gender Policy Council. So what did you think of that and sort of the language surrounding that? He, of course, was saying this is necessary because we have sidelined women's issues under President Trump, and we need to help women in this way. So what was your take?
Well, it's a talking point. It doesn't really reflect what we saw in the Trump administration. I mean, it certainly reflects things that at times, came up in Trump's own words prior to the campaign and his own behavior and the mistreatment of women. And I think we can acknowledge that. But there was nothing in his administration at all that undermined the rights of women, unless you equate 2 things. First, you equate the rights of the unborn with an attack on women's reproductive rights. And secondly, if you believe that there are, many genders, and gender is actually not a binary and it's on a spectrum and it's not connected to biological sex, which also was part of these announcements that President Biden made, both for marking International Women's Day and then producing this council on gender, because in that announcement, of course, you have to do this, is you have to say something about transgender rights, and here we are again talking about this issue. I feel like we have talked about this issue on Breakpoint at the Colson Center nonstop since the president was inaugurated, and the reason is we've been talking about it nonstop since the president was inaugurated. And the reason for that is he's been talking about it nonstop, and the administration has been talking about it nonstop. And for all of those that wondered whether this was going to be, kind of part 3 of the Obama administration, it's at least part 2, because the second term of the Obama administration was dedicated, at least in terms of his top priority in domestic and foreign policy. And this is something that I think that history has to reckon with the Obama administration about, is our first African-American president chose to elevate the rights of sexual minorities, and his track record on racial issues was mixed to, he deprioritized it to elevate LGBT issues, which says something that's so astounding about how this movement has progressed, which is by basically hijacking the oppression and the suffering of racial minorities and using it as their own, and then basically getting all the goods. And of course, that's the whole story of the transgender issue when it comes to women's rights, hijacking the disparities that have existed between men and women in rights and in certain social roles, and calling it their own. When in reality, it's now become a movement that directly targets and victimizes children in particular. There's so much to say about this, and we've said it over and over and over. So if people come to breakpoint.org, they'll get a show notes list that's as long as my kids' Christmas list, because
basically everything we've written in the past 6 months, it feels like
that it's so much, and I'm tired of talking about it. I've said it over and over. I don't want to talk about this anymore, but it's really where it is. And I don't know if you saw this, Maria, but then you have the ACLU this week post a tweet, and a set of tweets. This was fascinating. This is the same thing that we're seeing in the president's executive orders in the founding of this policy council, where the ACLU said no one has the right to say what a woman is. And then in the very next tweet, guess what they said? Trans women are women. So no one has the right to do this, but we do. And you kind of say, who's running these feeds, and how did they do this without their head exploding? To say, no one has the right to do this, but it's like the woman.
That person needs a comedy special. Like, that's such an astute, ironic claim that, like, it's a parody.
Yeah, it's like the woman on the airplane who says, "John, don't let anyone tell you what's right and wrong." It's like, you're telling me what's right and wrong right this moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I had the same reaction, obviously, with the, we're going to call it a gender council. It was so obvious what they were doing, which, again, just undermines supposedly the whole purpose of the thing in the first place. But I also, setting that aside for a minute, I just find this stuff so condescending. It's so hard to take because, I watched the president's speech when he was announcing this order, and he does the obligatory first half of like, women have, stood up and built this country, and they do it through the face of opposition. And, I mean, obviously there's truth in that. Women are half the society. We do a lot of the work of building culture and building the world and stewardship. I don't need the president to remind me of that or to act like women are only ever strong and culture builders. Like to me, it's the equivalent of somebody like bending down to my eye level and saying, "Good job, sweetie. Like, it's okay. You did a great job." I can't stomach that, and it made me think too of, I still think about this now because she's the vice president. I think about this a lot. But during the Kavanaugh hearings, when Justice Kavanaugh was undergoing his confirmation hearings in the Senate, Kamala Harris was a senator. I don't even think I knew who she was. But this is when Christine Blasey Ford had come forward with the accusations against Kavanaugh. And people were making, this was like a cultural touch point. People were making like pins that said, "Believe all women," and "I stand with Dr. Ford," and whatever else. And I remember Kamala Harris tweeting, "Women, you can come forward and tell your story. We will give you dignity." That's what her tweet said. "We will give you dignity." And I think I like fell out of my chair when I read that she's going to give it to me. I don't have it, but she'll give it to me. And unironically, she said this, and she meant it, evidently. And that's what this sort of council makes me feel like, that it's people in power saying, "You don't have this, but we'll give it to you. And we will allow you to feel important and appreciated and valuable. You don't have that on your own unless we do this for you." And that is the exact opposite of what they're saying that they're doing. You know what I mean? I mean, to tell someone you're giving them dignity is so undignified to that person that they don't have it already. That's what this feels like.
Yeah, and of course, on the larger cultural front, the other irony here, or the other, I think, inconsistency here is basically this idea that anybody can be a woman and
Right.
can claim to be a woman. And so the loss of a definition about what it means to be female, and I'm not just talking about with the transgender issue. I mean, you can see the confusion if you go back to a video that the Colson Center produced in the "What Would You Say" video. Joseph Backholm, who helped us get that whole thing off the ground and started, went to the Women's March back in 2019.
I remember this.
And
yeah.
It's an astonishing thing to go to a bunch of in the middle of a bunch of women who are celebrating women and saying, "What is a woman?" And then realizing that if they misstate this, they're going to step outside the bounds of what's politically correct or socially correct, and they really struggle. I mean, one of them actually says, "This is a trick question," and how is this a trick question? This is not it's not a trick question. And then just a week later to go back to the March for Life, and there is Joseph asking the very same question to a bunch of high school Catholic girls, and hearing the response with just utter clarity. Yeah. And at the same time, those girls kind of looking around saying, I know what I'm about to get if I say this out loud, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's really this remarkable contrast. But as our colleague Shane Morris has pointed out over and over and over, with his beef with, for example, superhero movies right now, even in the genre, you have women being great women if they act and behave like men. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I appreciated most about the book 7 Women by Eric Metaxas. Is the very beginning of that book. Right. He actually points that out, and he says, these 7 women that I'm about to talk about, and they're remarkable women. I've had my daughters read that book, and or at least one of them. It's time for the rest of them too. I said, I told Eric, I said, I think that's the most important part of the whole book is this line in the middle. He goes, "Is our culture says that women are great if they basically shun their womanhood, if they deny their reproductive capacities, that's part of their biological identity, if they behave like men, that is what makes them great women." And he said, these are 7 women who are great because they are women. And that line, that whole idea is what inspired the Strong Women podcast that my wife and Aaron Kunkel are running. And it's so cool to have people listen to it and go, I thought this was going to be one of those, ladies things.
Right.
And I have some opinions about what they mean, but I'm not going to say it. I'm going to let you just comment if you'd like to. You don't have to. I'm just going to let that go. But they just do a great job, basically, with high expectations for diving deep into what's true and what's good, lives that matter, that are courageous, but not because they're masculine, not because suddenly a woman who can take on 7 men in a room,
right,
and
right,
beat
and
them all up.
not because they're masculine, and not like despite their femininity either. Like, it's not like, look what they did, even though they have this handicap of being female.
That's the line, isn't it? I mean, that's just what's so missing here, and it's even, I think, inherent in the what you quoted about our vice president, saying during the Kavanaugh hearings.
Yeah. The other weird thing about this council, and then we'll move on, is that really what they're talking about, I think I read his announcement 4 times to try and figure out what he's actually saying they're going to do, because it won't be much. This is bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake and for the talking point's sake. But he's basically saying we're going to make sure that as we pursue, domestic and foreign policy, that we keep women's issues in the forefront. So I kind of sat back and was like, so you're policing yourself? Like, you're basically saying, I don't trust myself in my administration to honor women as equal to men. So I need to appoint this new committee to make sure that we don't forget about women's issues, as if world's issues aren't women's issues. And it was just it's such a weird verbal gymnastics kind of thing that doesn't quite make sense to me.
Well, you're right. And of course, the history here is that, in the early days, and the history here is that during first wave feminism, so think about Susan B. Anthony and the other early feminists, there were ways in which women were being left out of world issues. I mean, I often kind of walk through it this way: that first wave feminism was about inequality of rights, that there were basic human rights, the ability to govern themselves, all kinds of different things. That social norms were getting in the way of, and so this was about equality and rights. And I think it was largely the right movement. It largely accomplished the right things.
Yeah.
But it was when the sexual revolution hijacked feminism, somewhere in the middle of the second wave, where we went from men and women being equal in rights to men and women being equal in roles. Now, there were some roles that had nothing to do with whether you were a man or a woman, that women were being left out of, and those were good things to tear down. But there were also roles that were based in that fact that men and women are actually different, right?
Right.
And of course, we know where that's gone, where now men are claiming women's roles on athletic teams, women's roles as mothers on the cover of Time magazine. This is the strange kind of beast that this has turned into. And so we know, for example, at least under this administration, now who knows in future administrations, whether this council will stick around, or this will be one of those kind of Mexico City volleyballs from one administration to the other.
Right.
That women's issues means reproductive rights, which means abortion. And again, this is one of the most profound insights, and I owe this to Katie Faust, and I owe this to a number of Dr. Jenny Morse and others who have pointed this out, and that women's rights today means basically being antagonistic towards their own bodies and the function and capacity of their own bodies. Having children gets in the way of being a woman, as opposed to having children is one of the distinct, amazing things about being a woman.
Right.
That's a denial of biology, but it also is a denial of, so you go to a women's march and a group of women don't know what it means to be a woman. you look at the most obvious thing that distinguishes a woman from a man. It's the ability to bear children, right? And saying, nope, that actually gets in the way of being a woman.
Right. That's an intense reversal of reality. So I also find that deeply condescending as well. And I say this a lot when I talk to people about abortion and so-called abortion rights, is that the pro-life movement has the corner on empowerment and the concept of empowerment here. Because when you equate, like you said, women's issues with abortion, essentially what you're telling women is, you have to have this option because you can't handle this. If you become pregnant and you didn't intend to, or you don't want to, or whatever it is, or even if you're in really tough circumstances, you are not strong enough to deal with this situation. The pro-life movement are the ones that say, you absolutely are. In fact, you were made to be able to do this. And hopefully there's a church and a community and people that can come around and help you do it. And that's another part of the pro-life movement, is building that infrastructure, I think, through pregnancy resource centers and other areas. But I really find that incredibly condescending. And that's another issue.
I think that's a remarkable insight. I don't think I've ever heard anyone bring this up, that again, treating women as great because they're acting like men. I mean, what is one of the things about every movie in which we celebrate the heroism of man is that something unexpected comes up that's going to be a challenge, like a war or a terrorist or a kidnapping. And they, and so now women can do this too. But the one thing when it comes to unexpected pregnancies, women can't handle that. And that's a remarkable insight. Yeah.
And I'm just saying that as a woman who, during my first pregnancy, was pretty sure I couldn't handle it. And somehow I did. And I did it a second time.
I met the kids. They're doing fine.
Okay, and John, actually, we have to go to a break real quick. But speaking of the Strong Women podcast, I just wanted to bring up that I think this week we have an episode with Elisa Childers. And Sarah and Aaron talked to her. She's incredible. She just has a way of sharing apologetics in such a smart and articulate and just kind of a kind and relatable way. So she's really awesome. She wrote a new book this year, kind of pushing back against progressive Christianity. So super exciting to have her on the Strong Women podcast. So we're going to go to a break, and we'll be right back. Okay, we're back with more Breakpoint this week. I'm Maria Baer alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. So, John, we were just talking about the new gender policy council thing, whatever, that Joe Biden announced this week. And we were talking about women's issues in particular, which I still kind of don't know what that means. I think you're right that really is just an aphorism for abortion. But what I wanted to talk about now, too, is I saw the news this week about Andrew Cuomo. So Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York, he's facing sexual assault allegations now. He was facing allegations of sexual harassment first, but this week a woman, it sounds like, came forward and alleged actual assault. And so the complaint has been forwarded to the police, is my understanding, and that they're investigating at this point. And kind of a big deal, some of the biggest Democratic state legislators in New York came out and asked for Cuomo to resign. And I have to tell you, when I was reading about this, and obviously Cuomo's had his issues, that he's been dealing with a scandal already with underreporting nursing home deaths, and just the fact that he forced nursing homes, now we're finding out, he forced New York's nursing homes to take in COVID-positive patients when the hospitals were overrun. And some of these nursing homes weren't prepared for that, and they didn't tell their other residents, and there's just all kinds of issues circling around him at this moment. But I have to tell you, when I first was reading about this and I saw some of the sexual harassment in particular, allegations against him, I saw a picture of him talking to a young woman who I think was on his staff. And it was a picture somebody took at like a social event. They were at a restaurant or something. And he was holding her face, like he was touching both of her cheeks with both hands. I mean, it looked innocuous, but my stomach sank because I have experienced that before, that kind of really uncomfortable, kind of condescending treatment from men like in power or in leadership, where they could plausibly say, I was just being kind. Like, I really like you, or I think you're brilliant, and and they could mean that. Like, a person could plausibly say and mean that, obviously these assault allegations have come out against him, and it's not painting a great picture, but I know from working in ministries before and in churches that this exists. This kind of stuff happens in churches and ministries as well. And what's missing from the sort of the Me Too conversation, I think sometimes, unfortunately, is we go from 0 to 60 and we say these men are pigs. Like this, they're predators, and they're hunting down women. And there's no space for the conversation of like there could be well-meaning men, especially older men, who really don't mean to make anybody uncomfortable, but they think that kind of treatment is okay. And worse, they think that women like want it. I remember one time in particular, just because it was such an embarrassing moment. I was walking to like a board meeting at a ministry that I was working for, and a colleague of mine who was an older man, as I was walking with a bunch of other people that worked there, just looked at me and said, "Don't you look cute in that skirt?" In front of all these people who were in leadership over me, and I was about to be a part of this board meeting with them. And I could have like crawled under the floor. And I don't think he wasn't a predator. I don't think he meant anything violent by it, but it was so uncomfortable and undignifying and embarrassing. And when I saw that picture of Cuomo, I just was like reliving some of those. And I think it's an issue that we need to talk about in the church and stuff too, where it comes from a place of not thinking of women, maybe you're not valuing women in the same way in certain contexts, like in professional contexts in particular, where we're treating them as if they're younger than they are. I don't really know what it is. Have you seen this before?
I have, and I'm really sorry that happened.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that I've been in all kinds of situations where it's happened and I haven't even noticed. And I think that's
Sure.
the important thing to bring out. We can criticize how the left has been talking about women and equating men with women, and men with gender dysphoria with women and so on,
Right.
but not miss the fact that, look, the first wave feminism needed to happen for a reason, and
Right.
there's still ways in which we see each other in wrong ways. So yeah, I'm really sorry that happened to you, and I can see that is the case. I think it's important too that you bring this up, that the Christian position on this is not that the left is wrong on this view, but it doesn't mean that the right, or whether we're talking about theologically or politically or anything, has it all down. The scandals that have taken place over the last couple years have been on the political right and the political left, and on the theological right and on the theological left, and from people that we revere and people that we despise. I think it's absolutely what it basically teaches us is something much more fundamental, which is that the biblical understanding of sin, and sin being foolishness, sin being blindness, all the ways that the scripture talks about sin, is that this is one of those stories that just kind of brings Proverbs, to the forefront. And says Proverbs has the human condition right. And that's really one of the things that I think is the most compelling public witness right now for Christianity, is that of all the different worldviews and all their different visions about what it means to be human and what's wrong with the human condition, the scripture gets it dead right. I think it was Blaise Pascal who said, humans are the glory and the garbage of the universe. And that's exactly the case. We're not the glory alone, and we're not the garbage alone. We're both. And that is the problem with other worldviews that say, well, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. Honestly, we've talked a little bit about this internally, and maybe this is the time to bring this up. There's been a big pushback since the Ravi Zacharias issue came to the forefront, of people saying that we ought not say things like "there, but for the grace of God go I." And I think I know why people are pushing back so hard on it, because if it's like, well, it happens all the time, so it's no big deal, then that's the wrong thing to say. And I agree. Like, this is a big deal, and it's a big deal particularly for the victims, and we've seen the wake of this, even in the how vast the implications are of Ravi's sin. But I also don't want to lose this fact that I might not wake up tomorrow and make that same decision, but if I make the wrong decision today, tomorrow, and the next day, then I am one capable if I am trending in that direction. Let's use that language of making the same really, really bad decisions.
I think that's
thinking that I will get away with it.
I think that was what I heard when I heard people saying, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." It's not so much that they're like, "Well, you know, you never know what I might do. I consider sin to be inevitable in every moment of my life." I think it was less that and more, I want to be realistic about what I'm capable of. And I keep thinking this: if I had the opportunity to spend time with two different people, one person who says, I believe I'm capable of anything, even though I'd like to not think that. I think I might be. And so I'm going to watch myself and be careful and ask for the Lord's help and the Holy Spirit. And then on the other hand, you have a person who says, yeah, I guess I'm sinful, but there are certain things I just know I would never do. Like I can just tell you from now until the day I die, I will never do that. I think I would trust the first person more. And it's not because they're saying, you know, from any given moment, I might do something terrible. It's because they're wise enough to not trust themselves so completely as to let down their guard. And that's what I heard. I understand the pushback, like you said, that to some people saying, there, but for the grace of God, go I, sounds like boys will be boys. And that's, you know, that's not what we want to say. And that's not what anybody meant, I don't think. But I think it's that word capable. It's just recognizing that that's what you're capable of. In the same time, in the context of the Ravi Zacharias situation, what he did happened on such a scale that I don't think it's realistic to expect that any man or woman walking around has the capability, just on a scale level, of doing that same sort of thing. I mean, there were so many things that happened along the way that necessarily had to happen to enable that. The fact that he had access to all these financial resources on his own, the fact that he had his own electronics that nobody else was seeing, that he owned these massage parlors, that sort of thing. I think it is reasonable to expect that other sinful people, it's unlikely that a lot of people would fall into that same exact pattern.
But even that speaks to what we need to know about the human condition, which is that more capacity enables more evil. I mean, does that make any sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Technology won't save us. Medicine won't save us. This was the lesson of the 20th century. If there's a singular lesson of the 20th century, is that going into the 20th century, as technology was exploding, as human knowledge was exploding, as the scientific revolution was bringing around remarkable changes, the utopianists said, we're going to fix the world because we figured it out. We can economically determine, or we can, eugenically determine, or we can, even in some sort of kind of politically determined utopia. And all this technology, all this new knowledge, all this new way of doing things, it's going to make things possible that were never possible before. Yeah. Like nuclear war, that made that possible. And I think that's a lesson to be learned on a societal level, but it's also to be learned on a personal level, that more capacity gives you more capacity for good, but it also gives you more capacity for evil. And that's the human condition. And I'm not, and there's not a justification for this. There's not a rationalization. There's not say, well, it's not that bad or anything like that. It really is bad. I mean, you talk about the power that, and it's such a weird thing to be putting these two men in the same conversation. But going back to the Governor Cuomo situation, I mean, listen, the nursing home issue is horrific. Mm-hmm. This was a eugenics sort of experiment. Mm-hmm. Now, whether it was intentionally that way or whether it was, I don't know how else to do it. There were a particular group of people that were extremely vulnerable, and there was a guy who had the power. And that power and that vulnerability combined means the number of nursing home deaths in New York is shocking. Yeah. And the complicity here comes from the media, who have been hailing him as the champion of COVID since the very beginning. It is an indefensible position on every level to say this. And why? What, from the very beginning, the celebrity status that he got as a champion of the pandemic was that he held really kind of entertaining press conferences. I mean, think about that criteria. It's so weird and it's so wrong at the same time.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're back. Welcome again to the Breakpoint This Week podcast. We're going to continue with more of the major news stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. So, John, we were just talking about Andrew Cuomo and his handling of the nursing homes and the just crazy number of nursing home deaths there from the COVID pandemic in New York. And we were also talking about the sexual assault allegations against him and the harassment and the treatment of women. And as we were talking about that, I'm really glad you brought up, you kind of mentioned Proverbs, that, this is where, when we're talking about how to treat fellow brothers and sisters, like just how to treat others, Proverbs is where you can turn for that sort of thing. And, I thought a lot about this when our former president was the president as well, because, these issues came up then too. I remember seeing footage of him one time meeting Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, and he shook his hand and then he shook his wife's hand. And this was televised, and he said something like, "Wow, you are in incredible shape. You must really exercise a lot." And then he brought Melania over and was like, "Melania, look at her. She exercises a lot. Doesn't she look great?" And I remember deciding then, if I can't imagine I would ever have this opportunity, but if for some reason I were in Washington, D.C., and I had the option of shaking his hand, I would not do it. And it wasn't because I wanted to make a statement against President Trump or, I hated his administration or anything like that. I just thought I would do anything to not be subjected to that kind of thing. And unfortunately, you could tell by the fact that he did it on television and elsewhere that he thought he was being complimentary. Like, he thought she wanted to hear that, which itself is so condescending. But anyway, I'm so glad you brought up Proverbs, because one of the things I think about with this sort of thing and how it exists sometimes in Christian circles is that too many times we sort of, we were talking earlier in the show about this new gender council and how weird it is when you really stop and think about it, to say, well, there's women's issues over here, and we're going to make sure we focused on these women's issues. Then we're going to get to like the real world issues, and there's no overlap between them, or they're not involved with each other or whatever. Sometimes when we look at the Bible, I think, in evangelicalism, we'll say, well, if we want to learn about women, what women should do and how to treat women, there's lots of places we can go. We can look at Proverbs 31. We can look at 2 Timothy. We can look at Rahab, as opposed to saying, the Bible is as much for me as it is for you. The things that God expects of men, the things that God expects men to do and act in the Proverbs and the Psalms, he also expects of me. When Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me," he was talking to me too. Like, he wants everything that I have to offer him, not just my femaleness or whatever roles that I can play because I'm a woman. That's not all of me. So he has the same standard of good behavior and treatment of others for me as he has for you. And that to me is extremely empowering. So the book of Proverbs, even beyond 31, I think is there for women as much as it is for men.
The rest of Proverbs applies to women too, because
Exactly.
it applies to human. No, it was true. I often talk through what it means to be made in the image of God. We're going to dedicate the whole Wilberforce weekend to this, because I think it's such a critical, crucial issue. And if you go to the narrative in Genesis chapter 1, it's so remarkable. And I feel like that whole conversation has been hijacked by other questions that the text is not, prioritizing. I think the age of the earth, for example, matters. I have opinions on that as well, and learned from some of the best on that issue. But the text itself is Genesis 1:2, which has often been that verse that has been highlighted as is that the secret to the gap theory or whatever else. And the fact of the matter is, what it says is the earth is empty and it's formless, and the rest of the chapter is actually telling you what God does with an empty universe and a formless universe, is he fills it and he forms it. And so you can go day by day. Genesis 1:3, let there be light. And then he separated the light from the darkness. So he fills the emptiness with the light, and then he separates it. And he fills and forms, all the way up to the creation of the image bearers. And what does he tell the image bearers to do? To fill and to form. Right? Now, right there in that little window, and Genesis 2 is going to unlock what that means, but right there in that little window, you have this kind of blessing that God gives to the created order. And I always love how Lewis portrays this with Aslan singing, in The Magician's Nephew. But he says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea. And that's the other thing, is you had God essentially sovereignly speaking. I mean, this tells you how in charge God is he speaks and it exists, right? And then this great ruler then says, now I want you to rule, to the image bearers. And then in the middle of this, it's really interesting. So God created man in his image, male and female, he created them. So before we know Eve's name, we know that she's made in the image and likeness of God. It's not just the Proverbs. It's not just, the specific stories having to do with, Isaac and Rebecca, or, Ruth, or something like that. It's this the narrative at the very beginning. And of course, what we learn later on in Genesis chapter 2 is, in order to fulfill that mandate, be fruitful, multiply, and God gives this to the image bearer, and then he says something's not good before the fall. After saying it's good, it's good, it's good, it's very good, in Genesis 2 he says it's not good. And what's not good? That man is alone.
Being alone.
It's not that he's lonely. It's not that he's emotionally needy. It's not that he needs someone to keep him company. It's that he needs help. What does he need help doing? Ruling and filling and forming the earth, right? He can't fill it by himself. He can't rule it by himself. He needs to there needs to be more of them. And God, in his kindness, creates this whole, the procreative system in order to fulfill those purposes. So you get that big picture, and it's a package deal from the very beginning, Yeah. And we have that endorsement of what it means to be made in the image of God, male and female, at the very beginning of the story.
Yeah. And I happen to have some insider information here. So I know that Glenn Sunshine, our colleague, is writing sort of a really helpful booklet about some of the ways that us being made in the image of God, some of the implications that has for how we live. And we're going to give out that booklet to attendees at the Wilberforce weekend in May. So just another extra incentive to come, because he has a lot of really beautiful things to say about some of the same themes that you just brought up. So, John, remind me the website. Is it wilberforce.org?
Wilberforceweekend.org, wilberforceweekend.org, and it's a remarkable lineup. We also have a whole conference on Friday, so the weekend is broken up into a number of different kind of events. Obviously, we're going to commission all the Colson Fellows on Sunday morning. That's always a highlight, those who have finished their study with us. Friday night and Saturday is kind of the main meat of the conference on the idea of the image of God, and we're going to walk through the image of God and then walk through creation, fall, redemption on Saturday with some remarkable folks that are going to be joining us, and all that's listed there on the website. Folks like Carl Trueman has written, I think many people are calling it the most important book so far in the 2020s, and many people are calling it the most important book so far this century, basically since the turn of the century, which, 10 years ago is not that impressive, but we're 20 years into it now, so it's pretty impressive. There's been a lot of books written. Also, the Benham brothers, David and Jason Benham, who I think have a remarkable ability to stand up for what's true and also see the image of God in every single person. Rebecca McLaughlin, a remarkable apologist, is going to be joining us. Monique Dewson to talk about issues of race. We're going to talk about issues of mental illness and suicide, how we can be redemptive to the image and some of these challenging issues. But also on Friday during the day, we have kind of an intensive, it's kind of what we're calling it, and we're going to drop into this issue of male and female, image of God, male and female. And Ryan Anderson is going to be joining us from EPPC and a number of other folks. So, wilberforceweekend.org, and it's filling up. And so far, we've got some space still. It is filling up, and we're not sure capacity. Obviously, these things could change. We're going to be in Fort Worth, back in Fort Worth. So that's where we're going to be at the beautiful Omni property there. So I hope folks can join us.
Yeah, that's going to be. I'm really looking forward to it. John, who's the baseball team is there a baseball team in Dallas? Is it the Rangers?
Yeah, that's right.
So
I'm not much of a baseball guy. The Mavericks are there. Do we want to talk basketball, or are you really going to talk baseball?
No, thank you.
Okay.
My husband is a big baseball fan, and he's been trying to get to all of the stadiums in the U.S., and he only has a handful left, and I think he needs to get to that one. So if they're playing that weekend, we might have to go to a game when we come down for Wilberforce weekend.
There you go.
It'd be really fun. Well, John, we had one more thing I wanted to talk to you about this week, and that was a opinion piece that ran in the New York Times called "The Empty Religions of Instagram." And I loved this piece so much. She wrote this sort of about this rise of a trend on Instagram of particularly women who have kind of become like gurus. So they're sort of combining like self-help and wellness and maybe some like pop psychology. But this writer in the New York Times kind of equated them to pastors. They essentially are filling a religious kind of void for a lot of people, in particular women, on Instagram. So I actually wrote down a whole quote from this piece because I thought it was so well written and such an astute observation. Here's what she wrote. Left-wing secular millennials may follow politics devoutly, but the women we've chosen as our moral leaders, and she in particular, she talks about Glennon Doyle, who's kind of a leader in this area, Brene Brown, sort of, kind of like Oprah-esque kind of women that are running Instagram at this point. So she writes, but the women we've chosen as our moral leaders aren't challenging us to ask the fundamental questions that leaders of faith have been wrestling with for thousands of years. Why are we here? Why do we suffer? What should we believe in beyond the limits of our puny selfhood? And I loved this so much that I immediately went on Twitter and went to follow her. I think her name is Lee Stein. And I was like, oh, I'm going to write her an email. Wow, what a great piece. And then I see her, she has a tweet that's like, guys, you would not believe the number of Twitter direct messages I've received over the past 12 hours that are like pleads to accept Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. Like, you guys have to stop. But it's so sweet because she's so clearly thirsty for that. And she wrote that she was brought up in a Christian context and that sort of thing. But I just thought this was an incredibly astute piece. Did you happen to read it?
I did. Yeah, it's really something. No, look, celebrities kind of posing as pastors or celebrities taking the place of pastors is really nothing new. Right. My pastor says, when a couple was having marital problems when he started his ministry, when he started in the ministry, the first people they would go to is the pastor. And then it was the first people they would go to is the counselor. And then it was the first people they would go to was the lawyer. And I think maybe it's morphed again where the first people that many go to are kind of their Instagram celebrities. I've often talked about, in her heyday, Oprah really being kind of the new guru of the New Age movement. There was a clear mark where she went from being a remarkable interviewer, which she still is, as we saw this past week with the interview with Harry and Meghan, to being a spiritual guru in so many people's lives. And while I appreciate that the observation that a lot of times the reflections of these kind of self-help gurus. And look, again, you could talk about the music of the Beatles playing that sort of role, at some point in the 60s and 70s, mainly 70s when they really turned spiritual. You could certainly talk about, folks like even pastors becoming more celebrities than pastors, right? I mean, all of this is part of the same thing. But they are dealing with worldview issues, right? Even if they don't ever get below the surface, even if they don't ever get deep enough to actually wrestle with what we would call the ultimate questions of where did I come from, why am I here, what does it mean to be human, what happens when I die, what's right and wrong. That's how we frame the ultimate questions around the Colson Center. Even if you don't get to that level, to say, for example, girl, you got this, in the ways that they say it, and as repetitive as they say it, is basically reflecting a deeper view of what it means to be human and whether people are sinful or not.
John, I do got this though. I just want
just
that
for
to
the
be
record.
Known.
Just
I do
for the
got
record,
this.
I never questioned it.
Thank you. Good. Okay.
Yeah. But this is, and there, I think we're reflecting kind of worldviews as well by kind of the persona they put out. I mean, Glennon Doyle was very popular when she was married to another man. And she often referred to her Christian faith. And then in the middle of this announces that she's getting a divorce, that she had met a soccer star and was going to marry her, the soccer star. And so she, basically left a marriage, went over, to a lesbian relationship, gets quote unquote married, in that context. I mean, that reflects all kinds of deeply held beliefs about did God make the world a particular way, what it counts as right and wrong, who gets to say. And of course, the line you hear so often from these folks are, you have to follow your truth. Now, I don't want to put them all in the same category because I don't think they all do have the same message. My point is, a lot of them do. There's kind of a niche there, but there are some that would have a better message. There are some that are very popular on Instagram, and for example, N.T. Wright has quite a following, on social media. But of course, what he is bringing to the table is something dramatically different. But there is something to say about a culture in which people believe their spiritual authority to be a disembodied avatar, as opposed to any sort of responsibility to their own local body or to their neighbors or that sort of thing.
Right.
This is what we've been talking about during the pandemic, and the idea of church being non-essential. And our point was the church has already been non-essential for a whole lot of Christians for a really long time. Mm-hmm. So the church being non-essential is a pre-existing condition that's made worse by COVID. It's not created by COVID. And I think that's partly because we derive spiritual authority from places that it doesn't belong. But this piece was really insightful. I don't think that millennials in particular are inflicted with this. I do think that Gen X women kind of started this trend in a lot of ways, and then of course the celebrity Christianity is not something that is. She really targeted her analysis at women. I think that it goes both ways depending on who you're kind of looking for.
Yeah, and I want to say too, I appreciate what you said, that some of these women have some good things to say. I really personally like Brene Brown. I've read a couple of her books. I don't like when she sort of offers up a sort of watered down, vague Christianity kind of thing. But she's incredibly smart, and she is a psychologist by training, so she has a lot of insight. I don't know what Glennon Doyle's profession is. Outside of now on Instagram.
Well, she started as one of the mommy bloggers.
Okay,
right?
so that makes sense.
It was like, I'm in the trenches with you as a mom, and then really has been elevated because of remarkable kind of marketing. And there's obviously something there that people are they're scratching a need. But here's one of the things I want to ask you about this, and I don't because one of the things that I have long appreciated is this idea of a big enough worldview. So the fact that these what did she call them? This was such a great word, insta-evangelist. It's like televangelist is insta-evangelist. I love that phrase. One of the things that there's no question they're peddling worldview. They're peddling deeply held beliefs. They're peddling a way of seeing life in the world. They're definitely peddling a way of seeing yourself, right? That, it answers the question, what's wrong with me and how do I fix it? And a lot of times it has nothing at all to do with the gospel analysis of what's wrong with me and how do I fix it. Is this a setup, though? Because if you don't get the human condition right, then when something hits you from the side, a deep failure personally or somebody else against you, a natural disaster of some kind, deeply felt pain and hurt. Garber's line is that, and he was talking at this time specifically about students, that students need a big enough worldview. So when if they've only seen Christianity in this narrow way, and then they go to university and suddenly they're getting attacks on Christianity from all sides, their worldview is not big enough.
Yeah. And
it seems to me that that's going to be a flaw of so many insta-evangelists, is that they're giving such a narrow kind of self-helpy view of life and of wholeness and of inner peace or whatever.
Yeah.
That it's not going to be able to handle real marital problems or addictions that inflict a family for years, maybe even longer. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I have a lot to say about that. Because I think they do offer. Is that shocking that I have a lot to say? John's laughing at me.
No, please.
I think they do offer at least a whole worldview. I wouldn't call it a big one, but I think their answer to all of that, to any sort of suffering, is it's someone else's fault. That's their answer, right? Because if, girl, you got this and you follow your own truth, if your marriage is struggling, leave your marriage. If your friendships are struggling, you have to leave toxic people behind. If the world gets hit with a pandemic, it's because your neighbor refused to wear a mask at the grocery store. Like, you can see this play out on every level, everywhere. This is Kamala Harris saying we will give you dignity because we have to rely on everyone else to have any sort of happiness or whatever for ourselves. And if we don't find that we have it, it's someone else's fault. This is why we have so much of the cultural tension we have now, is because we can't deal with our own either unhappiness or discontentment or jealousy or even real suffering. We don't know how to make sense of it other than to say this had to be someone else's fault, which of course falls apart the minute you actually interrogate it in an honest way. Because if someone else hurt you, then you have the capability of hurting someone else too. And if nobody here is innocent, then what do we do? Because the same person who's saying to you, girl, you got this, is also saying it to the girl who hurt you. So who's right? And that's, one of my biggest pet peaves.
That's a real logistical challenge, isn't it?
It's an issue. One of my biggest pet peeves of these people on Instagram, and I swear, like, John, go on Instagram today, you'll find someone who said something like this. They'll do a post that's like, if you're having a bad day, or if you're struggling or whatever it is, I see you. I see you. I hear you. You're not alone. And I'm like, you don't. You can't see me. You can't hear me. And I can't see you or hear you. Like, that's the most embarrassing, like, weird thing to say. And that gets back to what you're saying about the church and actual human interaction, is like, why are you posting this kind of, that's the whole problem with you right there, is that you by nature can't see me or hear me or know anything about me. And yeah, I don't understand why we would look there.
You just sounded like the
people.
Jordan Peterson of mommy bloggers right there. Like, I think you should do this. You should be the anti and just start going, I don't see you.
I literally can't hear you or see you. I know nothing about you.
Yeah.
I'm not thinking about you.
Well, as Chuck Colson used to sum up, there's a lot of different ways to categorize worldviews around different questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? And so on. But two of the most fundamental questions is what's wrong with the world and how can I fix it? And it seems to me what you're saying, and you know more about these folks than I do, but this idea that what's wrong with the world is them, and how do you fix it is to look inside. And it just reminded me of one of my favorite lines from a series that Chuck Colson did right before he passed away called Doing the Right Thing, which was a series on ethics, and they were talking about, on a philosophical level, the problem with this idea that we are all, the center of our own kind of ethical framework or ethical universe, and that the answer is to look inside. And sort of my friend Michael Miller, who's worked for the Act Institute for a long time, a remarkable guy, and he said, we've told this whole generation of young people to look inside and to go find themselves. It's like, what if they find themselves and when they do, they're jerks? What now? It's like it's
really upsetting.
It's a great point. Yeah, no,
like,
it is.
This can't be it, right?
Yeah, when you're the problem, and that's what we say, and that's even going back to the issue of womanhood and how we talk about what it means to be a woman and gender and so on. That there's a lot of ways we're falling down on that issue, and sometimes these folks. The idea that we always believe the woman is always right is that the woman is always never the one at fault. And there's all kinds of ways that moral guilt is pushed outside in our attempt to try to fix maybe past problems. And that it doesn't help if it's not true, because eventually gravity wins. Eventually you come face to face with those things. Eventually you realize, no, I've made a mess of things. And what happens in that culture is there's no forgiveness available, right? You need to be, how did you put it? You're toxic. You need to be put out. Yep. And there's no restoration and no forgiveness.
Yeah. And that's somehow considered brave, even though I think that's the opposite of brave. Yeah, and then just as a woman, I want to be considered capable of creating just as much of a mess as men can create. Okay, give me that dignity, I guess, if you're going to give me that. Talking about that trend of looking inward instead of outward, and maybe being a little disappointed with what you find. Our colleague Shane Morris interviewed Kyle Strobel this week on the Upstream podcast about prayer. And I have actually set aside a chunk of time this weekend to listen to it. I'm really excited because prayer is something, it's hard. I think everybody struggles with it. And so I think this is going to be a really helpful. I'm looking forward to hearing this conversation. So you can hear the full conversation as well at colsoncenter.org/upstream. That's going to be Shane Morris interviewing Kyle Strobel. And we'll play a little snippet of it right here so you guys can hear it too. And then we'll be right back with our recommendations for the week.
It's very interesting that many of us assume prayer is a performative act. And by that, I mean that what we're doing is we're performing, and we have to make sure we do the performance well. And that alone as an expectation is devastating, because the second the performance doesn't feel like it's going well, and let's be honest, like, most of us don't leave an hour of prayer feeling like, wow, I just nailed that, right? We leave an hour of prayer going, oh my goodness, what has happened? And most of it was sleep, quite honestly. Like, that was a nice nap, and then I thought about my week, and we turn inward, and we begin to kind of think that we need to kind of prod ourselves.
Okay, John, it's the best part of the program. It's time for recommendations. I'm going to let you go first this time. So
you want me to go first?
Yeah.
So I'm here actually just scanning here, trying to find this exactly where the original source of this is. But we will find it, and we'll post it to breakpoint.org on the show notes. I actually put it out on Twitter this week. The most remarkable thing I saw this week, and it's a hopeful thing, is an interview that was a part of the Jordan Peterson podcast. I know there's a lot of people who really, really love Jordan Peterson. I haven't followed him as closely as some others, but there's been a couple of remarkable moments in this guy's life. And of course, he has a huge draw. He has this ability to look people in the eyes and tell them what's true, especially young men. But there have been 2 videos with Peterson that make me absolutely certain that the Hound of Heaven is after him. And so we have this ability to kind of see this up close and personal. The first one was a video of when he spoke at what's called Convo at Liberty University. It's the short for convocation. It's 13,000 people there in the gym, and this is before the pandemic. And he's on the stage with 2 of the administrators there at Liberty University. And in the middle of his conversation, he's being interviewed. And Peterson is not a Christian, that he admitted, especially at the time. The second video is where I'll come back to that. But in the middle of it, a young man stormed the stage at Liberty University. And he wasn't angry. He wasn't, accusing Peterson of bigotry or anything like that. He was asking Peterson to help him. Help me. I don't know what to do. And he just basically collapses in tears.
Oh my God. And
how that was handled on stage, both by one particular administrator and by Jordan Peterson himself, was stunning. You see this moment where Jordan Peterson realizes that people actually listen to him, that people actually that people are actually broken, especially young men, and they actually need help. And there's this overwhelming feeling. You can just see it on his face. I mean, he wears his emotions out front anyway, even though as stoic as he is, you can kind of see it. And it's a remarkable moment because right after that, then the person leading the conversation prays for the young man. And he's deeply moved by all this. You can just see him kind of like trying to process this. And at the end, they ask him, why don't you believe in the resurrection? And his answer is not of a cynic or a skeptic or someone who's absolutely certain. His answer is fantastic, of a true seeker, of something happening. Now, fast forward till, I guess, just a week or 2 ago.
Yeah.
And of course, in between, Jordan Peterson has some sort of mental breakdown. He gets addicted to a painkiller as part of a surgery and all kinds of things. And now he's back on his podcast, and he's interviewing someone who asked about Christianity. And Peterson talks about how Christianity is this, perfect mix. And in fact, I want to just kind of read what he said because it was remarkable. He talks about how it's just kind of this perfect mix of historical fact and myth. And he wasn't talking about myth like, some parts of this story didn't happen. He was talking about it more the way that Chesterton uses it, like it's a defining narrative of the universe. At least that's how I think he was using it. So in the middle of this, as he's reflecting on Christ and he's reflecting on the resurrection, he says this: I probably believe this, but I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it. And then he goes on after, and he's in tears actually as he's talking about it. He goes, and I don't know what would happen if you did fully believe it. It's just this remarkable thing. And it was so much like C.S. Lewis. He's like, I don't want to believe this, but I do, and because of so much that had happened in his life. And I don't know. Look, I'm not saying that he's, not still, that he's in or that he's out. I don't know. This is not my call. I just know that it's beautiful to watch the Lord work in someone's life. And if you've ever been able to watch it up close and personal, if you've ever been able to watch, the Holy Spirit kind of doing the lasso thing and pulling people closer and closer and closer, and the admission through the whole thing that there are truths to the Christ story that are beyond his understanding, and yet he still might believe it. For an intellectual like Jordan Peterson, who basically has everything figured out, 12 steps to this and that and the other, it's just something to watch. And I think, it's not something to watch for theological precision. That's not there in this clip. What's watching is God's doing something. And man, it would be really something for his own peace and his own wholeness for, beyond. I mean, a lot of people are saying, man, I wish he would be such a force for the gospel, and I'm sure he would. But what's more important now is that he finds forgiveness for his own sins, that he finds who he was made to be, by being restored in Christ. And it's just something to watch. Yeah. So that's my recommendation, and you can probably Google it and find it. But come to breakpoint.org. We'll find that clip and post it in the show notes.
And what a beautiful thing to say. That I love what he said. I don't know what it would mean to believe that, because to me, immediately it just made me think of the parable of the seed spreading on the ground, and some of it gets choked, and some of it goes down deep and bears fruit. And I think if a person is counting the cost even beforehand, like if they understand what kind of decision they're making, I hope and pray that is the seed that's going deep into the soil. That's, ready for the adversity that will bring. All right. That's really cool.
Your recommendation?
Okay, my turn. I heard a podcast this week that blew my mind. No pun intended. So this is about the brain. This is an episode of the Sam Harris podcast. He's a neuroscientist himself, and he interviewed a neuropsychologist. So the difference is the neuropsychologist actually sees patients. The episode, it's the Sam Harris podcast, which I think is just called the Making Sense podcast, but the name of the episode is The Divided Mind. And it's an interview with this guy, Ian McGilchrist, who's a British guy, has a really awesome accent, who has written a book called The Master and His Emissary. And it is about the hemispheres of the brain and how they interact with each other, and essentially what happens when they're not interacting. And it was the most fascinating. Like I literally want to listen to it again because there's so much there. And also being a writer, as I was listening to it, I just kept thinking, oh, that's a sermon illustration. That's a sermon illustration. Like there's so much metaphor in there. But basically, the master and his emissary, he's saying, he's pushing back against the normal, sort of the accepted wisdom that the right brain is kind of subservient to the left brain, that the left brain is where you handle language and all that, so it's really the more important hemisphere. He actually contends that the right brain is where we can understand concepts. So even if we don't have language, the right brain is more important. So he calls the right brain the master, and he calls the left brain the emissary, where the left brain kind of does the bidding of the right brain. But they talk about all of these experiments and that have been done or conducted on people who've had, for example, like right hemisphere strokes or left hemisphere strokes, or people who their corpus callosum, which is the center membrane that connects both hemispheres, what happens when that's been severed, either through injury or they had a defect when they were born. And it is unreal. Did you know, John, that there are people for whom their hemispheres, let's say, are split. There are cases of like someone reaching for a dress to put on with one hand and the other hand putting it back. Like they literally, they spend probably an hour talking about, are there two people in here? Like who are kind of two separate people trying to figure out how to live within a person together. Wow. And then that leads them to talk about what makes a person, what is consciousness. You know, they talk about the phenomenon of like, let's say you're trying to think of a word. This happens to you and I constantly when we're doing this podcast. And thankfully we have editors who can help us. But you're trying to think of a word. You can't think of it, but it's in your brain somewhere because you can exclude other words. So you can be like, is it this word? No, it's not that one. So somewhere you're conscious of it, but not in what you're currently experiencing as consciousness. Mm-hmm. And that has like a lot of weird implications. Like there's a you in there that you're not fully aware of. Anyway, it's extremely, extremely fascinating. The episode is called The Divided Mind. And it's on the Sam Harris podcast.
So I got to throw my Christian apologist hat on here because we know Sam Harris is an atheist.
Oh,
he's a diehard naturalist.
Yeah, but I'm so praying that he's like Jordan Peterson. And I think he's friends with Jordan Peterson because the questions he has, sometimes I'm just like, Lord, he's close.
Well, so think about just everything that you just said and say, now all of that has to be explained within all the stuff that's in this box. Just nature, just natural processes. And some of that stuff is really hard to explain. In fact, one of the most interesting apologetic avenues has to do with things like near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences where you're separated from your physical brain and you see something that actually happened. Now, I'm not talking about visions and, mystical sorts of things. I'm just talking about that, and we're not talking about, people who saw a heaven or a hell and therefore it proves it. We're just talking about the facts that were verified that somebody saw something that actually happened in a place away from their body right around this kind of time, which means if all of our thought and all of our existence and all of our personality and all of our quote unquote what the ancients would call the soul are located in this hunk of meat, that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So he's got to explain that. But the bigger one is what Alvin Plantinga called the fatal flaw of naturalism, which is, okay, that's the remarkable thing this hunk of meat can actually do for us, right? Let's even take out the near-death experiences and what all that might be. But just kind of right here, everything that this piece of meat can do for the rest of ourselves. And where did it come from?
Yep.
And a naturalistic humor. It was an accident. Well, if it's an accident, we shouldn't be able to trust it, right? If I shake up a box of Scrabble letters and it says move to California, I'm going to think that's weird, but I'm not going to hire the moving truck, right? It's not something I'm actually going to do because it's not a trustworthy piece of information. Mm-hmm. But all of this stuff, Harris has to explain why we should trust. And think about this. All the things we've learned about the brain have come through the brain. So why should we trust the things that we've now learned? It's Plantinga. There's a remarkable article that was written years ago where Alvin Plantinga, one of the great Christian philosophers of our lifetimes, talked about the fatal flaw of naturalism. It was in a journal called Books and Culture. I don't think it's still there, but if we can find it, I'll link to it because it's worth reading along with your recommendation. So sorry, I hope I didn't just mansplain your recommendation there. It's just such a fascinating.
No, I'm just making a note of it, John. Just making a note.
Well, you're not to blame. I'm to blame. It's not your fault.
I have the same. I go through the same thing every time. I make mental lists of all the presuppositions that Sam Harris obviously has that he's obviously unaware of. And it's that, again, is part of the reason I'm really hopeful for him because he's incredibly brilliant and he's got to be asking these questions somewhere. So hopefully he will. Okay, well, that's all the time I think we have this week, John. This was really fun. This was a fun conversation. Well, I'm glad March Madness is happening for you. Sorry about Duke, though. That stinks.
Well,
how did you end up a Duke fan? They're in North Carolina.
Yeah, everybody asked me that. So my earliest basketball memory is Ralph Sampson at the University of Virginia.
Oh, I'm so bored. I'm so bored right now.
Yeah. Why you asked, man? Come on.
I know. Sorry, I'm teasing you.
So Ralph Sampson, ACC team. Okay. I was in Virginia. Then Virginia kind of fell off the map, and Duke had its heyday. Okay. It was just their rise. I mean, I just coincided with their rise. So
right. I feel like I'm supposed to be a Cavs fan because I grew up like very close to LeBron James' house, but
he's
yeah,
not a Cavs fan anymore.
just,
He's only been a Cavs fan
well,
every couple
I know,
years.
but I think the
Maybe he'll
Cavs
come back
fans
again.
still own him. Yeah, I just can't bring myself to care enough. Okay, thank you guys so much for being with us. Again, you can find links to all of the stories we mentioned today, as well as lots of other great resources at breakpoint.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Maria Baer alongside John Stonestreet, and we'll see you next week.